She thought he was dead when he fell off that horse, a stranger bleeding into her snow, a ghost from stories meant to stay buried. But when Josie dragged him into her barn, she didn't just save his life. She invited a storm that would tear open old wounds, rewrite family legacies, and transform a dying ranch into a sanctuary of second chances. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about the fierce power of staying when everyone else leaves, and the kind of love that roots itself so deep it blooms for generations. The first time Josie McCall saw the man, he was slumped across the saddle like a broken fence post, blood seeping through his coat in slow, steady rhythm. His horse was lathered and breathing like a bellows, eyes wild, hooves sinking deep into the mud just past the edge of her property line. She thought for a moment that he was dead. She stood motionless by the corral gate, her breath caught in her throat, one hand still on the handle of the rusty bucket she'd been using to feed the chickens. Her daughter, Mary Beth, stood barefoot on the porch behind her, squinting into the dusk. "Mama," she whispered, "that man's gonna fall." He did, just as the words left her mouth. Josie dropped the bucket. It hit the dirt with a hollow clang, grain scattering like startled birds, and she was already running, her boots kicking up wet soil, apron fluttering. The man landed hard on his right side, unmoving, his face pressed into the dark Montana earth. His horse gave a final exhausted snort and collapsed beside him, legs folding neatly beneath its weight like it knew it couldn't take another step. Josie knelt beside the stranger, her hands shaking. She pressed her fingers to his neck. The pulse was there, faint but steady, buried deep. "Mary Beth," she shouted, "get the old quilt from the chest and a lamp, and tell Tommy to get the wagon out front. Now!" The man groaned as she rolled him over. He was heavy with muscle, his coat soaked in blood and snowmelt. A pistol was still strapped to his thigh. She unclipped it and tossed it aside, then peeled back the lapel of his coat. Beneath it his shirt was stiff with blood, a wound just under his ribs, hot and weeping. "I don't know who you are," Josie muttered, as she tore open the buttons with fingers that still bore the ink of her husband's name on their knuckles. "But you picked the wrong night to be dying." Within minutes the children returned, Tommy barefoot and clutching the reins of the mule-drawn wagon, Mary Beth dragging a folded quilt nearly as big as she was. Together they hoisted the man up. He didn't wake. They laid him in the back of the wagon. Josie climbed in beside him, her hands already soaked through with blood, and as the children led them toward the barn, she pressed both palms to his side and prayed, not loud, not formal, just a whisper to God or whatever angel might still be watching over lost souls on dirt roads. That night the snow came down harder than it had in weeks. The wind howled across the flat land, rattling the shutters of the barn as Josie scrubbed the blood from the stranger's chest, stitched his skin with a needle she hadn't used since Frank died. Her hands remembered the motion, even if her heart didn't. She wrapped the wound tight, boiled water over the old iron stove, crushed wild sage from the shelf above the feed bin, all while her children slept in the hayloft above, wrapped in the quilt she'd meant to sell in town come spring. The stranger's fever came fast. He muttered names, none she recognized, begged someone named Elijah not to shoot, whispered something about a deed, a signature, the Murphy boy. She changed his bandages by lamplight, fed him spoonfuls of bone broth from the rabbit she'd trapped 2 days earlier. He spit it up the first time, then swallowed the second. She wept, but only once, when she stepped outside to pour the dirty water into the snow and caught sight of the horse's tracks already filling in behind them. It was 3 days before he opened his eyes. They were dark, blue so deep they looked black in the lantern glow. He blinked once, then again. His gaze moved slowly, taking in the rafters, the hay, her hands wrapped around a bowl of water. "Where?" "You're in my barn," she said before he could finish. He tried to sit up and hissed through clenched teeth. She pressed him back gently. "Don't be stupid," she said. You've got a hole in your side big enough to drive a spoon through. You move wrong, you'll bleed out before I can boil another thread." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Name's Cole," he rasped. "I didn't ask," Josie replied, "but I suppose it's good to know what to carve on your tombstone." He coughed a laugh, then groaned at the pain. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning back to her work. The snow didn't let up. By the 5th day, he could sit upright without groaning. By the 7th, he was asking for bread. On the 8th, Tommy came down from the loft with wide eyes and whispered, "Mama, that man's got a brand on his boot." She found it that night while he slept, faint, burned into the heel leather, a half circle over 2 lines. She hadn't seen that brand in years, and she knew then who he was. Cole Thatcher. Rumor had it he'd shot 20 men, bought up half the territory between Helena and Great Falls, then vanished when his brother was murdered in a land dispute. Some said he'd gone east. Others said he'd died. But now here he was, in her barn, under her roof, eating her bread and bleeding on her floor. She should have kicked him out. But when she looked down at his sleeping face, she saw not a gunslinger, but a man with deep lines around his eyes and blood crusted in his hair. She saw a man who had almost died in the snow and now breathed because she'd said yes. The next morning she sat beside him with a rifle across her lap. "I know who you are." He didn't flinch. "Then you know I'm not your problem. You bled in front of my children. I didn't ask you to patch me up." She narrowed her eyes. "You think I did it for you?" He looked at her. Something passed between them. Tiredness, maybe, or shame, or something older. He nodded. "Thank you." She waited for more. He didn't offer it, but he stayed. He split wood when he could stand long enough, helped mend the roof when the wind tore off the shingles, taught Tommy how to saddle the old mule without getting kicked, sat with Mary Beth while she read from the Bible aloud, her voice wobbly but proud. When she caught him watching her one night as she braided her hair by lantern light, she almost said something, almost told him to go, but instead she said, "There's a pot of beans left. Eat before the kids get at it." And he smiled, just a little. The first real smile she'd seen on his face. Spring came slow that year. So did the letters. The first was from a man named Vance Murphy. It wasn't signed, but the seal told her what she needed to know. It said, "Thatcher's dead. We'll be coming for what's ours." She showed it to Cole. He read it once, then again. His face didn't change, but his hands gripped the paper like they meant to tear it in half. "I can leave," he said, "before it gets worse." "You do," Josie said evenly, "and I lose this land by June. I've already missed the bank's deadline. They're waiting for me to fail." His jaw tightened. "Then I'll handle it." She didn't ask how. She didn't have to. He met with the banker 2 days later, came back with a slip of paper and a check. She didn't ask where the money came from. But the next week, a man in a fine coat and shiny boots came riding up to the property, hat in hand. Said he worked for the Thatcher Trust. Said the land had been placed under new management. Said Josie McCall was now its legal tenant with full rights to harvest, sell, and live without interference. He tipped his hat to her and rode off. Cole never explained, but from that day forward he moved through the ranch like he belonged there. When the children called him Mr. Cole, he didn't correct them. When Josie left an extra mug on the table at breakfast, she didn't either. And when the first flowers bloomed on the edge of the porch, she found a new pair of boots beside the door, her size, soft leather, laced up neatly. No note, just the gesture. That fall, when a man came riding in with a gun on his hip and a snarl on his lips, Cole met him halfway to the porch. They talked in low voices. Then the man turned around and left. He didn't come back. No one did. The ranch thrived. So did the family. And every time Josie looked at the man who'd once bled in her arms, she wondered how fate could be so cruel one moment, so generous the next. She never asked him to stay. He never said he would. But he did. Because some debts go too deep to name, And some love stories don't need to be spoken aloud to be real. They're written in the silence between fence posts, in the way a man keeps watch when no one asks, in the way a woman sets 3 places at the table instead of 2, and in the way a family grows not just from blood, but from choice, from trust, from second chances, from one cold night in a barn when a stranger fell from his saddle and changed everything, forever. The morning sun cast its pale light across the frost-covered field as Josie McCall stepped out onto the porch, rubbing her chilled hands together and pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The soil had hardened overnight, and the wind carried the sharp edge of coming snow, even though the calendar claimed spring had arrived. She looked out at the far ridge, her gaze following the broken fence line that had once marked the proud edge of the McCall ranch. Now it was just a stretch of leaning posts and snapped wire, the property a shadow of what it had been when Frank was alive. It had been 6 years since the fever took him, 6 years of holding the ranch together with worn leather and borrowed prayers. The cattle were nearly gone. The plow was broken. The well had frozen solid 3 nights last January and cracked at the seam. And the bank's letters came more frequently now, first polite, then insistent, now cold. But Josie didn't run. She patched the roof herself, taught Tommy how to keep the fire from smoking, showed Mary Beth how to coax eggs from the stubborn hens, and stitched the holes in her boots. At night she read aloud from the Bible by lantern light, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. There were too many memories in that house to leave, too many promises Frank had made with calloused hands and a heart too good for this hard world. She wouldn't give up, not until the land gave her no choice. That's when the gunshots came, not close, faint, far off, like thunder rolling down from the canyon. But they didn't belong to weather. Josie knew the sound of rifles well enough. She stood straighter, listening. 3 cracks, a pause, then one final shot that echoed too long and too loud. "Mama?" Mary Beth's voice was small behind her, clutching the doorframe with red fingers. "Was that thunder?" Josie turned slowly. "No, baby. Go back inside." She didn't. Mary Beth never did when worry painted her mother's face. Josie stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn. She didn't know why she was heading that way. Not exactly. Just a tug, a sense that something was about to change, and it was coming fast. It did. The horse appeared first, galloping awkwardly along the fence line, its chest soaked in blood, and its rider slumped over the saddle horn like a rag doll. The beast stumbled, slowed, and finally collapsed into the brittle grass just yards from the barn door. Josie froze. Tommy had come out now, too, barefoot and blinking in the cold. "Mama?" She held up a hand. "Get the water. Bring the rag bin. Now." He ran without asking more. Josie was already moving, boots crunching across frost. The man in the saddle didn't move. Blood streaked his coat, seeping from a wound just below his ribs. His face was pale, covered in dust and sweat. A gun was holstered at his hip, the kind of piece no man carried unless he meant to use it. But there was something else. A ring on his left hand, a silver one carved with a crest she didn't recognize. She reached for him. He groaned. "Don't move," she said softly. "You'll make it worse." He cracked one eye open, barely able to focus. His lips moved. "You, Josie?" Her stomach dropped. She'd never seen him before in her life. "How do you know my name?" she asked. But he was already unconscious. They dragged him to the barn. Tommy helped, his little hands wrapping the blanket tight around the man's middle, while Josie pressed the wound with rags soaked in warm water. The bullet hadn't gone clean through. She dug it out with shaking fingers and poured whiskey over the torn flesh while he writhed and swore and clung to life. She stitched the wound closed with thread meant for saddle repairs, whispering apologies every time the needle slid through skin. The fever came next. For 3 days he burned, delirious, muttering names Josie didn't recognize, Sam, Marcus, Red, Molly, begging for forgiveness, cursing someone he called Grayson. Once he shouted her name again, eyes wide and terrified like he'd seen her ghost. But she never left. She fed him broth from the last of their potatoes, bathed his face with cloths soaked in willow bark and mint. Mary Beth brought flowers from the creek bed, set them beside his cot like she believed it would help, and maybe it did. Because on the fourth morning he opened his eyes, clear and sharp. The first thing he said was, "Did I die?" Josie exhaled. "Not yet." He blinked. "Shame." She folded her arms. "I'd say you're welcome, but I'm not sure you deserve it." His gaze drifted to the rafters. "Where am I?" "My barn." He frowned. "Where's the girl?" Josie narrowed her eyes. "What girl?" "The one with the blue ribbon. She said I could rest." Josie didn't answer. Mary Beth had been wearing a blue ribbon since the first day he arrived. He winced, trying to sit. "What day is it?" "Tuesday." "What month?" "March." He let out a long breath. "Hell, I missed the trial." She stepped closer, hands on her hips. "You want to tell me who you are and why you're bleeding in my barn?" He looked at her again, this time with something behind his eyes. Weight, like he'd been carrying a truth too long. "My name's Silas Gentry," he said, "and I think someone's trying to kill me." That name sent a chill through her. Gentry. She'd heard it in town, on the wind, in stories half-whispered by cattlemen and freight drivers and bankers with soft hands and cruel smiles. The Gentry family owned more land in the Montana Territory than any three ranchers combined. They bought water rights and rail contracts, filed lawsuits against neighbors, and walked into saloons like they owned the sky. But Silas Gentry had always been the ghost, the youngest son who disappeared after the war, the one no one talked about. He looked like a ghost now. She didn't say his name aloud again, just nodded once and went back to her work. That night she stood in the kitchen with the letter from the bank in one hand and her husband's old revolver in the other. Snow had started to fall again, and Mary Beth slept curled on the cot beside the hearth. Tommy came and stood beside her. "Is he going to die?" Josie looked out the window toward the barn. "No, he's going to live." And part of her wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The next day Silas tried to stand. She stopped him. "You don't get to make decisions until you can walk without bleeding." "I've made worse decisions standing upright," he muttered. "Yeah?" she said. "I've buried 2 cows and a husband. I win." That made him smile. He stayed, helped repair the fence when he could walk again, brought firewood to the porch, let Mary Beth braid his hair when hers got tangled in the wind and he didn't know how to fix it. He taught Tommy how to hold a rifle steady and not flinch when the wind kicked up. He never said what he was running from, but the riders came anyway, 3 of them, mid-April, right after the thaw. They came with black coats and clean boots. One carried a letter. Another wore a pistol low on his hip like a man used to settling arguments with lead. They asked for Gentry, said they had papers to deliver, claimed it was nothing urgent. Josie stood in the doorway and didn't flinch. "You're trespassing," she said. "I've got 2 kids and a bad aim. Try me." They didn't, but they left a message. "Tell Mr. Gentry the vote's going through, and if he wants to keep his name on that deed, he'll show up in person." That night Silas sat beside the fire with his jaw clenched so tight it looked like stone. "I left all of it," he said. "The money, the company, the blood. I didn't want to be my father." Josie sat across from him. "And yet here you are." He nodded. "I told them to sell. Use the land for rail. I didn't care. But then I saw your fence, your barn, your kids with shoes 2 sizes too small, and I realized they'll do to you what they did to me. They'll starve you out. Wait until you're too tired to fight." Josie said nothing. He looked at her then. Really looked. "I can stop it." "How?" "I still own half the company. My signature freezes everything. And what do you want in return?" He paused. Then he shook his head. "Nothing. He looked away. "I just want to be someone my mother wouldn't be ashamed of." Josie stared at the fire a long time before speaking. You're sleeping in a barn with hay in your boots and a dog that snores louder than thunder. I'd say you're getting close." When he left, he didn't say goodbye, just left a note on the table and a satchel of money in the drawer beneath the sink. She cried, not for him, but because she thought maybe, just maybe, he'd meant to stay. But 3 weeks later, a wagon rolled up to the gate, and Silas was on it, with a lawyer and a deed and a contract naming Josie McCall the primary leaseholder of 640 acres of prime grazing land previously owned by the Gentry Trust. He handed her the pen, and when she signed, her hands didn't shake. "I'm staying," he said. She looked up. "What about your empire?" He took her hand. "This is it." They planted the first new fence posts together the next morning, side by side in the warming spring light. Silas handled the auger with surprising ease for a man still recovering from a bullet wound, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, shirt damp with sweat. Josie guided the post in straight, checking it with her eye, like she'd done 100 times before, but for the first time in years, her back didn't ache from doing it alone. The children helped too, Tommy carrying nails in his patched pockets, Mary Beth leading the mule with a solemnity far beyond her 7 years. Every now and then the girl glanced up at Silas, as if expecting him to vanish like smoke, but each time he smiled at her or handed her a square of jerky from his coat, her shoulders eased just a little more. The new fencing would protect the pasture for the first real herd Josie had dared to hope for in years. Silas had promised her 20 heads, heifers, good ones, already tagged and treated. He said they were waiting in Missoula, and they'd be delivered by month's end. "Consider it your signing bonus," he'd said, not long after he'd handed her that deed. Josie didn't know what to say to that. She still wasn't used to the idea of not struggling. But each time she woke to see the woodpile neatly stacked, or a new hinge nailed to the squeaky barn door, or Tommy whistling like he was just a boy and not a man in the making trying to carry too much, she felt a bit of that tightness around her ribs begin to loosen. Silas worked hard, slept little. He spent most nights out on the porch with a journal and a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey he never touched. Josie passed him in the dark once and glanced down at the open pages. They weren't numbers or contracts, they were letters to a brother, a mother, someone named Caroline. She didn't ask, and he didn't offer. But one night she brought him coffee and sat down without a word. The moon hung low and full over the ridge, casting everything in silver. The orchard trees were starting to bud, though Josie doubted they'd bear fruit this year. "Your family," she said. "You ever plan to see 'em again?" Silas didn't answer right away. "I don't know if I'm the kind of man who gets a second chance with people like them," he said finally. "I did too much, left too much undone." Josie sipped her coffee. "Funny," she said. "That's what I used to think about myself." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the air between them changed. She felt it. So did he. But neither of them moved. Instead, he said, "I like the quiet here." She smiled softly. "It doesn't like everyone back." In the weeks that followed, the ranch came alive. The herd arrived early, and Silas helped Tommy lead them into the new corral. The boy rode tall in the saddle Silas had bought for him, his back straight, pride blooming in his grin like spring wildflowers. Mary Beth took to drawing Silas in charcoal. She'd sit across the room and sketch while he read to her from newspapers or old books Josie had tucked away in the loft. "You look serious," she said once, showing him the page. "I am serious," he replied. She giggled. "Mama says you're just quiet, not brooding." He lifted an eyebrow. "She said that?" Mary Beth nodded solemnly. "She also said you look like you carry too much in your chest and not enough on your shoulders." Silas blinked. "What does that mean?" Mary Beth just shrugged and skipped away. When summer finally took hold, the wind lost its bite, and the earth turned from brittle brown to gold. Josie started baking again, first pies, then biscuits, then the sourdough she'd sworn off the winter Frank passed. Silas said her bread was better than anything he'd had at the governor's table. She didn't believe him, but she made another loaf anyway. He built a new door for the smokehouse. She embroidered his initials into a handkerchief and left it in his shirt pocket. No one talked about what they were building, but it was obvious to everyone, especially the children. One night in late July, Mary Beth came to Josie's room, hair mussed, holding a doll with one arm missing. "Mama," she said, "if Mr. Silas stays, does that make him our pa now?" Josie sat very still. "You miss your real pa?" The girl nodded. "All the time." "So do I." Mary Beth looked down. "But sometimes when Mr. Silas reads to me, I feel like I can miss pa and still be happy. Is that okay?" Josie pulled her close. "It's more than okay," she whispered. "That's what love does. It doesn't replace. It grows around what's missing." The girl nodded against her shoulder, her small hands clutching tight. Later, when Josie stepped out onto the porch to find Silas sitting on the steps with his boots off and his head in his hands, she walked over and sat beside him. "I think they love you," she said quietly. He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "I'm not sure I know what to do with that." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then stay long enough to figure it out." In August they danced. It wasn't planned. There was no music, just the two of them on the porch at sunset, Mary Beth asleep on the couch, Tommy out at the creek. Josie stepped into his arms slowly. He hesitated, then held her like she was breakable. Like this moment was, they swayed. And when he kissed her, it wasn't urgent. It was quiet, like a man saying, "I'm here, I'm not leaving." And she kissed him back, like a woman saying, "I believe you." That night she moved his things from the barn to the house. No one said anything. But the next morning, Mary Beth had drawn a picture of all four of them at the table. She'd written, "The Gentry McCall Ranch," across the top in crooked letters. Silas framed it. The winter came early again that year, but the house was warm, and the roof held, and the woodpile stayed high, and when the next banker came calling, Josie met him at the gate with the deed in hand, and Silas beside her, rifle slung over his shoulder. They didn't owe any more. They never would again, because sometimes the bleeding man in your barn turns out to be more than a gunslinger. Sometimes he's the answer to a prayer you stopped saying years ago, and sometimes, if you're lucky, love shows up not in the light, but in the blood and the cold and the quiet, and stays. Forever. The snow melted slower that year, even under the golden breath of April. Rivulets ran down the sides of the barn, dripping in time with the morning bird song. Josie stood with her arms crossed, leaning against the porch post, watching the sun catch the icicles like glass shards. The land still bore the weight of winter, but something about it looked softer now, less hostile. Behind her, Silas was humming. He never hummed full songs, just pieces of melody, something half-remembered, half-invented. It came out when he was calm, when he thought no one was listening. Josie never told him she heard it. He was fixing the kitchen chair again, the same one Frank had built when they were first married. Its leg had split again for Mary Beth, leaning back too far when she laughed at Silas's stories. Josie had been ready to toss it for firewood, but Silas insisted on saving it. "I like things that aren't new," he'd said. "Means they've survived." He was like that, too, worn down in places, patched and reshaped. And just like that old chair, there was something about him that belonged in the room. Not because he filled it perfectly, but because he made the others sit more comfortably around him. Tommy burst through the door just then, cheeks red with cold, eyes wide. "Someone's coming," he said. Josie stepped forward. "Who?" "Don't know. Wagon, 2 horses, one's wearing city tack." Silas's humming stopped. He wiped his hands and stood, eyes sharp now. Josie didn't need to ask what he was thinking. A man like Silas didn't forget threats. They never forgot him. He stepped out onto the porch beside her and squinted toward the road. "Recognize the horses?" she asked. "No," he said, but I recognize the wagon." They waited in silence as it rolled closer. The snow muffled the wheels, but they heard the creak of the frame and the jangle of expensive harnesses. Two men sat up front, wrapped in wool and smugness. The one driving had pale gloves and a waxed mustache. The other wore spectacles and held a folder against his chest like it might bite. They pulled to a stop. "You're Silas Gentry?" the driver asked. Silas didn't move. "I was?" The man nodded. "Then you're the man who's caused quite the stir in the Territory Land Board." Josie felt Silas tense. "What do you want?" she asked. The man in glasses cleared his throat. "We've come on behalf of the Gentry Company. The current board has reviewed recent filings, particularly the transfer of assets to Miss McCall here." He glanced down at the folder. That move caused some concern. "She's the rightful leaseholder," Silas said. "The board doesn't get to override a binding contract." "There are ways," the man said delicately. "Loopholes, clauses. Your family didn't appreciate your redistribution of assets." Silas stepped off the porch, boots crunching. "You come here to scare us?" The man smiled thinly. "No, sir. We came to make you an offer." He handed Silas a paper. Josie watched his eyes scan the page, then narrow, then harden. "Tell your bosses they can take this offer and burn it," he said. The man's smile faltered. "Now get off my land." They left without another word. By nightfall, the whole house felt different. Josie knew what was coming. So did Silas. "They won't stop," she said, stirring the stew. Silas didn't answer right away. Then, "I know." She set the spoon down. "So what do we do?" He looked at her, then at the children in the next room, Mary Beth reading aloud to Tommy from the book Silas had bought her on their last trip into town. "We give them something they don't expect," he said. "What's that?" "A family that won't be broken." And so they prepared, not with bullets or barricades, but with paperwork and witnesses and names carved into ledgers. Silas traveled to Helena twice that month, returning each time with more folders, more letters, more lines drawn in ink that even the Gentry board couldn't erase. When the land agents returned in June with a court order in hand, they were met by 2 lawyers and a federal marshal. Josie stood on her porch with her apron tied neat and her children beside her, watching as the men were turned away. They never came back. That night, Silas sat on the porch steps with a small velvet box in his lap. Josie didn't see it at first, not until the fireflies had begun to rise and Mary Beth had fallen asleep against her shoulder. He held it out. "I know we're already a family," he said, "but I'd like it to be official." Josie stared down at the ring. It was simple, no gem, just silver, like the one he wore, etched with the same crest. She didn't speak. She just took it and slipped it on her finger. And he smiled. In the years that followed, the ranch became something different. Not just land, not just legacy. It became a refuge, a place where broken things weren't discarded but mended, where children grew like sunflowers in the fence lines and cows lowed in contentment in the fields. People came from town to ask for help, to learn to fix their barns, to ask how Josie made her biscuits rise so high, or how Silas trained a horse that wouldn't take a bit. And always they were welcome, because love had made a home here, not the kind that comes easy, the kind you work for, the kind that grows around bullet wounds and bad history, the kind that wakes early and sleeps late and never once lets go. And in the middle of it stood Josie and Silas, side by side. Proof that sometimes the story doesn't end in the barn with a bleeding man and a frightened widow. Sometimes that's just where it begins. And sometimes it begins again every morning, with a sunrise over repaired fence posts and the sound of laughter through an open window. The summer of their second year brought rain like they hadn't seen in a decade. Long, soaking storms that swept across the plains and filled the dry creek beds until they ran thick and cold again. Josie woke each morning to the sound of water trickling down the eaves, the scent of wet sage in the breeze, and Silas's low voice whispering to the horses as he moved through the barn before dawn. The land responded like it had just been waiting for permission. The fields turned lush and green. Wildflowers carpeted the hills beyond the west pasture. And the orchard, long dormant since Frank's last attempt to revive it, burst into pale pink bloom. Josie stood barefoot in the grass one morning, staring at the blossoms like they were ghosts. "They haven't flowered since before Tommy was born," she murmured. Silas stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "Maybe they just needed time." She looked up at him. "Or maybe they needed someone to believe they still could." He didn't answer. He just reached down and took her hand. That was the summer Mary Beth turned 9 and asked to learn to shoot. Not because she wanted to kill anything, she said, but because she'd seen what happened when people couldn't protect the ones they loved. Josie hesitated at first, but Silas didn't. He handed the girl a small .22 rifle, showed her how to load it, how to breathe, how to stand still, even when her heart raced. "She's got steadier hands than I do," he told Josie that night. "She's got your eyes, too," Josie replied. He smiled at that. God help her. Tommy took to fencing like it was a calling. He'd spend hours walking the perimeter of the property, checking lines, hammering in stakes, adjusting wire, reinforcing corners. Silas went with him sometimes, but more often he let the boy go alone, trusted him to report back with honest assessments. "He's not a child anymore," Silas said one night as they watched him cross the southern ridge with a coil of wire slung over his shoulder. "No," Josie agreed softly. "He hasn't been for a while." That summer, they hired their first ranch hand, an older man named Elias, who'd worked rail lines until arthritis made it too painful to swing a hammer. He moved slow but steady, and had a kindness in his eyes Josie recognized. "You planning to run a full operation?" Elias asked one day as he leaned against the corral gate, watching Silas and Tommy herd a wayward calf back through the pasture. Josie shook her head. "No, just enough to keep it alive, enough for them to grow up strong." Elias nodded. "That's all a place like this needs." By late August, the barn was full. Hay stacked high, barrels of feed sealed tight, tools hung in neat rows along the back wall. Silas added a loft to the far end of the barn. "For quiet thinking," he said. Josie caught him up there sometimes, sitting in the glow of a lantern, writing in his old leather journal with the same reverence he once had for whiskey and revenge. One night she climbed up the ladder and sat beside him. "Who do you write to?" she asked. He looked over at her, the flicker of the lantern softening the lines around his mouth. "Sometimes my brothers," he said. "Sometimes just to the man I used to be." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached over and took the pen from his hand. On the next blank page, she wrote in her small, tidy script, "We are still here, and the world is still worth staying for." When she handed the journal back, Silas didn't speak. He just stared down at the words for a long time. Then he closed the book and kissed her forehead. That fall, the county fair came back to White Hollow. For the first time in years, the McCall Ranch entered livestock. 2 of their heifers won ribbons. Mary Beth placed 3rd in the junior marksmanship competition. Tommy beat the sheriff's son in the fence-building timed event. And Josie stood in the dusty circle of neighbors, holding Silas's hand, and felt, for the first time since Frank died, that she belonged again. They danced that night under the lanterns strung between cottonwood trees. The music wasn't loud. The fiddler missed a few notes. The ground was uneven. But they danced anyway. They danced until Josie laughed, until Silas forgot he'd ever bled out on the floor of her barn, until Mary Beth whispered to Tommy, "They're going to get married. I just know it." And she wasn't wrong. 2 weeks later, Silas carved a ring out of elk horn and gave it to Josie at sunrise. "I don't want a preacher or a paper," he said. "I just want to wake up beside you until we're too old to tell whose bones are cracking." She laughed, tears in her eyes. "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard." They married under the cottonwood, just the 4 of them and Elias. Mary Beth wore flowers in her hair. Tommy held his mother's bouquet. And when they said their vows, it wasn't ceremony, it was truth, because they'd already lived the hardest parts, the loss, the fear, the silence. Now came the rest, the harvest, the mending, the peace. And it came, slow and golden, like autumn sun through lace curtains. That winter the orchard bore fruit for the first time in years. Not much, just a few pears, 3 apples, 1 wild plum. But Josie stood in the frost, holding that plum in her hand, and smiled like she'd just seen the future, because sometimes the land blooms again, not because it forgets the pain, but because someone stayed long enough to heal it. Silas stayed, and Josie did too, and in doing so they built a life stitched together with forgiveness, trust, and quiet courage. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs, forever. The next spring Josie found a letter tucked inside the ledger where Silas kept track of their expenses. It wasn't sealed, not hidden exactly, just folded once and slipped between the pages like he meant for her to find it someday. But not too soon. Her fingers hesitated before opening it. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Neat, slanted slightly to the right, each word carefully formed, like he was saying them out loud, as he wrote. Josie, if you're reading this, it probably means I didn't get the chance to say everything the way I wanted. That happens sometimes. Life's like that, rough-edged and full of weather we don't see coming. So here's what I want you to know, plain and simple. You saved me, not just that night in the barn, not just with stitches and broth and that stern look you give when someone's trying to argue with you and you know they're wrong. You saved me with stillness, with that way you just kept going when everything else fell apart. With the way you looked at the land like it was worth saving, even when it didn't look like much. With the way you looked at me like I was a man, not a mistake. I didn't know I could belong to something again. Then I met you, and now I do. Yours, S. Josie read the letter twice, then a third time, then folded it back and slid it into the pocket of her apron. She didn't cry. She didn't need to, because Silas wasn't gone. He was on horseback just beyond the ridge, helping Elias and Tommy mend the last of the west pasture. He was still here, alive, present, and she knew without question that someday, whether in years or decades, if the worst came and he was taken from her, she'd find another letter like that one, and another after that, because Silas had learned how to leave pieces of himself behind not as warnings or regrets, but as anchors. That year the ranch began to grow in ways Josie hadn't dared dream. The cattle herd doubled. Silas brokered a deal with a neighboring rancher to share grazing land in the off-season. Mary Beth started keeping the books, sharp as a whip, and corrected Silas's math without flinching. Tommy, at 16, was strong enough to break his own colt and had already repaired 3 sections of roof without being asked. He whittled a handle for a new branding iron and carved the family's initials into it. MG for McCall Gentry. One morning in late June, Josie woke to find Silas already gone from their bed. She stepped onto the porch and saw him in the field, standing between rows of early corn staring up at the sky. When she called to him, he waved her down, motioned for her to join him. "There's something wrong?" she asked when she reached him. He shook his head. "No, just thinking." "Dangerous," she teased. He gave a quiet smile. "Been thinking about how far we've come. How many people would have bet against us getting this far? Most of them. And how none of that matters, so long as we remember what we built it on." Josie looked at him. "Which is what, exactly?" Silas turned, took both her hands in his, and pressed them against his chest. "Staying," he said simply. Later that summer, Mary Beth brought home a boy, polite, clean-shaven, nervous. Josie watched him like a hawk. Silas did worse. He handed him a rifle and asked him to help hunt dinner. The boy came back with a quail and an apology for missing the rabbit. Mary Beth was furious at them both, but she smiled at dinner when he made everyone laugh with a story about getting chased by a goose in the general store yard. "He's not half bad," Silas said that night as they stood at the kitchen sink together drying dishes. "I'm still watching him." "Good. So am I." That autumn, Tommy entered the county fair's livestock show with a steer he'd raised from birth. He won first prize. When they handed him the ribbon, he didn't cheer. He just looked at his mother and said, "Think Pa would have been proud." Josie knelt in the dirt beside him, pulled him close. "I know he is," she whispered, "and so am I." By the time winter rolled in again, the ranch had taken on a rhythm Josie hadn't realized they'd found, a quiet, dependable heartbeat. The fire was always lit before sunrise. The animals were fed before the sky turned gray. Laughter drifted from the kitchen every evening, and every Friday night Silas read aloud from the journal he'd kept for the past 2 years, a collection of notes, memories, and small, honest reflections. He read about the day Mary Beth shot her first rattlesnake, about Tommy falling through the porch and laughing even with a twisted ankle, about Josie standing in the doorway of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, looking like the whole world belonged to her. One night near Christmas, he read something different. "I used to think my father's legacy was land and law and the weight of a name. Now I know it was fear that someone would take what he had, fear that he'd never be enough without a title. I carried that for too long, but Josie handed me something else to hold, a mug of coffee, a shovel, a child's drawing, her hand in mine. And now I know what legacy really is. It's a boy asking if his father would be proud. It's a girl who can ride and shoot and speak her mind. It's a home that doesn't flinch when the past knocks at the door. It's staying, choosing, loving. This is the legacy I will leave, and I hope they remember." They did. In the spring, the orchard bloomed brighter than ever. Pale pink and white blossoms burst open, fragrant and full, the branches heavy with new life. The wind blew warm and kind. Josie stood beneath the trees with a ribbon in her hair and Silas beside her, their fingers entwined. And she knew, deep in her bones, that some stories didn't need to be written down to last forever. They just needed to be lived, together. The following summer, they opened the ranch gates for the first time in years, not for cattle buyers or loan officers or land agents, but for neighbors. Families from town came down the dusty road with baskets of bread, jars of preserves, and folding chairs slung over their shoulders. Children ran ahead of wagons, chasing each other through the tall grass, while parents followed at a slower pace, tipping hats and calling greetings. It had been Mary Beth's idea. "Everyone always says we're a miracle," she'd said one evening at the supper table. "Maybe it's time we act like one." So they hosted a gathering. Nothing fancy, just food and music and good boots on solid ground. Silas set up hay bales around the fire pit, and Josie baked 6 pies in a row until the house smelled like cinnamon and sweat. Tommy and Elias carved benches from the downed cedar by the creek. Mary Beth hand-painted a sign that read, "McCall Gentry Ranch, where the gates never closed for long." That night, beneath a sky full of stars, Silas took Josie's hand and led her in a slow dance across the dirt yard. The fiddle played off-key, and someone's dog kept howling along, but no one minded. The porch was full of laughter and stories. Lanterns swung gently in the breeze, and for once there was no talk of past debts or old wounds, only talk of crops and calves, of good weather, and the way the light looked coming over the east ridge. "You think this will last?" Josie asked softly, her cheek against Silas's shoulder. He held her a little tighter. "I think if it doesn't, we'll rebuild it." Later, when the guests had gone and the lanterns were dim, Tommy stayed behind to help gather dishes. Mary Beth sat on the porch with a baby goat in her lap, yawning. Silas poured Josie a glass of water and handed it to her with a tired smile. "You did good, Mrs. Gentry." She laughed. "Still not used to that." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You will be. You already are." By the following spring, word had spread, not just about the ranch's recovery, but about what it had become. People from farther out started showing up, strangers with sunburned shoulders and dirt under their nails. They came not to buy or beg, but to ask, "How did you do it?" Josie never had a perfect answer. She'd just smile and point to the soil, to the children, to Silas, and say, "We stayed." One family came with 3 boys and a battered wagon wheel. Josie took one look at their youngest, barefoot, coughing, and opened the spare room. They stayed 3 weeks. When they left, they had a goat, a sack of seed, and a promise to return next harvest. They did. So did others. A woman with calloused hands and a husband's name on a chain around her neck came one June with a letter she couldn't read. Silas helped her decipher the legal jargon and wrote 2 of his own letters in reply. She left crying and came back 2 months later with a deed in her name and rhubarb preserves for their pantry. In time, the ranch became more than a home. It became a place where people came to start again. Josie never intended to build a refuge. She just didn't know how to turn anyone away. Silas teased her about it, said she was going to fill the orchard with lost souls until the trees started asking for rent. She'd smile and shake her head. "They gave us more than fruit," she'd say. "They gave us back hope." One autumn afternoon, Josie found Mary Beth sitting under the largest tree, writing in a leather-bound book. "You journaling now?" she asked. Mary Beth nodded. "Trying to." Josie sat beside her. "What are you writing?" "I'm writing it all down," Mary Beth said. "The people, the pie recipes, the time the cow gave birth in the woodpile, how you and Silas never stopped touching each other like you're still surprised he's real." Josie laughed. "I just want to make sure it doesn't get forgotten," Mary Beth added, "that people remember this place started because you helped someone who could have brought trouble." Josie grew quiet. Then she said, "Trouble's just a test. Kindness is what comes after." That night, Mary Beth read aloud from her journal. She wrote about the storm that nearly broke the roof and the hands that rebuilt it, about how sometimes healing isn't loud, it's quiet work in the cold, with no one watching, about how staying didn't always look like bravery, but it always was. Tommy added to it the next week, his handwriting crooked, his spelling full of stubbornness. He wrote about the day Silas gave him the deed to the southern pasture, said it was time he ran something on his own. "I've never been trusted like that before," he wrote, "not since Pa. And Silas never said it was to make me a man. He just said he knew I already was." Years passed. Seasons turned. Babies were born, first from the goats, then from the daughters. Mary Beth married the boy with the goose story. They built a cabin near the orchard. Tommy bought a neighboring plot and raised his own cattle with a hand-me-down brand and a pride he never spoke aloud. And when the time came when Josie's hands grew slower and her steps more careful, she let herself rest. She sat on the porch in the evenings with Silas, her fingers curled around his, and watched their children run the place they'd saved. "Think we did good?" she asked him once, years later. He kissed her temple. "I think we did more than that." One night she woke to find him sitting in the rocker by the hearth, watching the fire. He looked peaceful, hands folded in his lap, his journal open on the table beside him. He didn't wake when she touched his shoulder. He was already gone. There was no ceremony, no preacher, just a sunrise, a gathering of neighbors, and the scent of sweetgrass on the breeze. They buried him beneath the orchard, next to the cottonwood where he'd first kissed her. Mary Beth carved the headstone herself. Silas Gentry, he stayed. In the weeks that followed, Josie finished his journal. She didn't try to write like him, she just told the truth. She wrote about the man who bled in her barn, who changed everything with quiet hands and gentleness sharp enough to cut through all her fear. She wrote about the children who grew strong, not because they were told to, but because they were shown how. She wrote about love, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that sits beside you in silence and never leaves. And she wrote this: "He thought he owed me his life because I stitched him up and fed him broth. What he never understood is that he gave me mine back in return. Every piece of it. Every morning, every smile, every pie. He was never my second chance. He was my always. She tucked the journal into the cedar chest beside the first one, the one Frank had kept years before, and she added a third, blank one, because she knew the story wasn't over. It never would be. Not while the gates stood open. Not while the wind moved through the orchard. Not while someone was still staying. When the next spring came, Josie's knees ached more than they had the year before, and her hands were slow to close in the morning. The old dog Boone no longer chased the chickens, but lay by the kitchen stove like he was guarding the warmth itself. The ranch, though, didn't slow. Not for age, not for grief, not for anything. The fences still needed mending. The fields still needed turning. The horses still needed tending. And Josie, who had built her life around quiet perseverance, did what she'd always done. She rose with the sun and put one foot in front of the other. The orchard bloomed hard that year. The trees, heavy with blossoms, sagged low like they were trying to kiss the earth that raised them. The scent drifted across the fields, into the house, through the open windows. Tommy said it smelled like wedding cake. Mary Beth said it smelled like memory. Josie said it smelled like resurrection. Silas had been gone for 5 months, and every day she found him somewhere. In the shape of the barn roof he'd rebuilt, still holding strong against March winds. In the scrape of the kitchen chair he'd repaired over and over again until it squeaked with his rhythm. In the children's laughter, grandchildren now, muddy kneed and loud, who climbed into her lap with the same trust their parents once had. On his birthday, Josie baked his favorite pie and placed it on the windowsill just like she used to. She poured 2 mugs of coffee, set one across from her at the table, and talked to him the way she always had. The things she said weren't loud or dramatic. She told him the creek had flooded early and that Tommy had handled it just fine, that Mary Beth had written an essay that got published in the Helena Tribune, that Boone still barked in his sleep like he was chasing ghosts. She told him she missed him, but she wasn't lost. That part of her life, the one defined by ache and fear, by hunger and helplessness, was gone now. Not because it had disappeared, but because they had built something stronger around it. "I'm not alone," she whispered, brushing crumbs from the edge of the table. "Because you stayed long enough for all of us to learn how." The ranch had become more than land, more than home. It had become a heartbeat, a rhythm, a place where stories didn't end, they folded into new beginnings. Each child, each hand who passed through the gate and picked up a shovel or rocked a baby or stitched a torn curtain added a line to the legacy. No one was forgotten, not Frank, not Silas, not the long line of women and men who had given everything they had to hold something together with love. Mary Beth started collecting their names. In a book with a blue leather cover, she began writing not just the big moments, births, deaths, marriages, but the quiet ones. The day Elias taught her youngest how to tie a proper hitch knot. The afternoon when Tommy caught her staring out at the orchard and handed her a sandwich without a word. The time Josie fell asleep under the cottonwood and woke to find her grandchildren piling petals around her like a quilt. "Someone should write it all down," Mary Beth said one morning, setting the blue book on the kitchen table. "Not just the good, but all of it. The hard years. The winters when we didn't think we'd make it. The way Mama stayed strong even when her voice shook." Josie smiled. "You're doing just fine." Mary Beth sat beside her. "Think we should publish it?" Josie laughed. "Publish? You want strangers reading about your uncle falling through the outhouse floor?" Mary Beth grinned. "I do. I want them to know it's real, that you don't have to be perfect to build something worth loving." And Josie couldn't argue with that. The years kept coming. New faces arrived, drifters, cousins, distant relatives, even a war widow from Nebraska who'd heard the ranch took people in and asked if she could stay the winter with her 2 boys. They gave her the guest cabin and made space for her at the Sunday table. By spring, She was helping Tommy with the calving season and teaching Mary Beth's eldest how to quilt. "We've got too many people to feed," Josie muttered one night. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "And too much pie to eat alone." She swatted his arm. The days passed gently now, not without hardship. Fences still snapped, calves still got sick, and grief still crept in on cold nights, but with purpose. The family had grown strong, not just in blood, but in bond. They had learned how to hold one another up, how to ask for help, how to give it. One summer, they hosted a wedding beneath the cottonwood. Not for family, but for two hands who'd fallen in love while branding cattle and singing old songs around the fire. The whole ranch turned out, even Elias, who wore a clean shirt and wept like the father of the bride. Josie wore Silas's ring on a chain around her neck that day. She touched it when the vows were spoken. And when the couple danced their first slow turn across the grass, she whispered, "He would have liked this." She didn't cry, she just smiled. Years later, when Josie was too old to walk without help, Mary Beth sat beside her with a fresh page of the Blue Book and asked, "What do you want us to remember most?" Josie didn't hesitate. "That he stayed." Mary Beth nodded. "And you?" Josie leaned back, eyes closed, voice soft. "I stayed too." She passed one winter morning as snow drifted softly outside, her hand in Mary Beth's, her breath calm and even. They buried her beneath the cottonwood next to Silas, under a headstone she'd carved years before with her own hands. Josie McCall Gentry. She chose to stay. And the ranch kept going, because stories like theirs don't end. They bloom again with every spring, in every child who learns to ride, in every loaf of bread pulled warm from the oven, in every stranger welcomed in from the cold. Because love like that, love that stays, isn't just remembered. It's lived, again and again and again. That spring, Mary Beth opened the front door and stepped into the early morning light with a mug of coffee in one hand and the blue journal in the other. The air was cool and smelled of wet grass and horses, and the orchard beyond the ridge shimmered with new blossoms, soft and trembling in the breeze. Chickens scratched quietly near the barn, and the sound of Tommy's voice drifted in from the southern fence line, giving instructions to the younger hands who'd joined the ranch over the past year. Everything was moving. Everything was alive. She sat down on the porch swing and opened the book. It was nearly full now, hundreds of pages chronicling decades of love and labor, of rain and drought, of babies born and elders buried, of Silas's first halting smile and her mother's last quiet breath. She turned to the most recent entry, her own handwriting from 2 days before. Planted a new tree for Boone near the barn. The kid said it should be a peach because he was soft like one. We all laughed until we cried. Mary Beth smiled and tucked a sprig of sage into the binding. The children came running up the porch steps a few minutes later, her daughter Elsie and Tommy's twins, Amos and June, covered in dust and wide-eyed. "There's someone at the gate," Elsie said breathlessly. "A man, with a scar." Mary Beth stood slowly, setting her coffee aside. "What kind of scar?" "On his cheek," Amos said. "Real long. Looks like a knife." "He said he was looking for the McCall woman," June added. "Didn't say which one." Mary Beth exchanged a glance with Tommy, who had just reached the porch with his gloves in his back pocket and a look of quiet readiness on his face. "I'll go," he said. "No," Mary Beth replied, already untying her apron. "I will." The man was standing just outside the fence, his horse sweating and nervous, his face lean and sunburned. The scar stretched from his left cheekbone to the edge of his jaw, and his clothes, though worn, were clean. He held a wide-brimmed hat in his hands. "Miss McCall?" he asked when she approached. "Depends who's asking." He nodded once, like he'd expected that answer. "My name's Nolan Granger," he said. "I used to ride under Silas Gentry back before—" Mary Beth's stomach turned, not in fear, but in recognition. She'd heard the name once from her father in a letter he'd written when he thought no one would read it, a name he'd circled and underlined twice. Nolan swallowed. He told me if I ever needed a place that wouldn't turn me away, to come here. She studied him for a long moment. Then she reached over, unlatched the gate, and opened it wide. Then you came to the right place. He nodded, eyes lowering. I'm not looking for trouble, just a bit of ground and honest work. You'll find both, she said, and coffee if you're lucky. He blinked, then smiled, just a flicker, small and careful. As he walked through the gate, the children watched from the porch. Elsie whispered, "Does he get to stay?" Mary Beth looked at them, then at Nolan's retreating figure. "Everyone stays," she said. "That's the rule." Nolan proved his worth in a week. He fixed the windmill before anyone asked. He untangled the yearling's leg from the fence without spooking it. He found an old journal in the barn, one of Silas's earliest, the pages brittle and yellowing, and returned it to Mary Beth wrapped in cloth. "I didn't read it," he said. "Didn't seem right." Mary Beth took it carefully, her throat tight. "You're the kind of man my father believed in," she told him. "I didn't used to be," he said softly. "None of us were." By summer, Nolan had carved a bunkhouse for himself at the edge of the property. Tommy said he worked like a man trying to atone for something. Mary Beth said maybe he was. The children followed him like ducklings. He taught Amos how to sharpen a knife, June how to climb a tree safely, Elsie how to whistle with her fingers, and late at night, when he thought, no one heard, he played the harmonica out on the bunkhouse porch. Slow tunes, mournful and beautiful. It reminded Mary Beth of her father, of the man who once bled into the dirt behind the barn and changed everything, of the man who gave more than he ever took, of the man who stayed. That fall, they held another gathering under the cottonwood. Tables sagged under the weight of food. Children danced barefoot in the orchard. Lanterns flickered like stars come down to earth. Josie's portrait hung from the porch railing, framed in carved oak, and beside it a plaque Silas had commissioned long ago, finally mounted in its rightful place. This ranch was built not on fortune or fame, but on faith, in each other, in the land, in the quiet power of staying. Mary Beth stood at the head of the table, blue journal in hand. She cleared her throat, and the noise softened. This year, we welcomed a man who thought he wasn't worth saving. We told him what my parents told everyone who crossed our gate. We'll decide that ourselves. And like everyone else, he proved he was more than his past. She glanced at Nolan, who sat beside the children, his hat in his lap, eyes lowered, but listening. We've lost, we've grieved, we've changed, but through it all, we've stayed. And that, more than anything, is what makes this ranch what it is. She closed the book. Elsie ran up and grabbed her hand. "Can I read next time?" Mary Beth nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. It's your story now, too." And under the cottonwood, as fireflies danced and music drifted through the orchard, the story continued. Not because it had to, but because it could. Because someone once, long ago, had chosen to stay. Years passed the way they always did on the ranch. Slowly, then all at once. Seasons came in with wind and dust, then melted into memory as the sun rose on a different year. Mary Beth's hair turned silver. Tommy's shoulders stooped a little more. The children grew taller, then left, then returned with children of their own. But the gate never closed, and the porch light was never out. The orchard became more than a place where blossoms bloomed. It was where weddings were held, where birthdays were celebrated, and where every newborn calf was blessed with a name and a ribbon of cloth tied loosely around its neck. The cottonwood tree stood tall over it all, roots so deep that even the driest years couldn't kill it. When people came from out of town and asked why the tree mattered, someone always said, "Because that's where it all began." The journals multiplied. The original 3, Silas's, Josie's, and the first Blue Book, had been joined by more than a dozen others, each hand-bound and marked with initials and dates. They were kept in a small cabinet in the parlor now, one Silas had built himself in his last year. Mary Beth ran her fingers over the spines each Sunday before dinner, choosing one to read aloud at the table. That became tradition, stories before supper. No one ever argued. One evening, as winter settled in, Mary Beth stood at the window watching the last of the light fade behind the barn. She was older now, slower, but her mind remained as sharp as her mother's had ever been. She could still recite the entire deed transfer Silas had gifted Josie. She still remembered the names of every man who'd once tried to steal their land. But what she remembered most vividly was the night he came, the man who changed everything, not with power, not with threats, but by bleeding out in her mother's arms and deciding, in the hours after, to stay. Mary Beth sighed and stepped outside. The cold air bit through her shawl, but she didn't mind. The frost sparkled across the grass like stars caught on the ground. She followed the worn footpath down to the edge of the orchard, to the simple headstones beneath the cottonwood. She stood between them, one hand resting on each stone. Josie McCall Gentry, she chose to stay. Silas Gentry, he stayed. "I remember," she whispered, and then, as if summoned by the words, her granddaughter appeared beside her. Elsie, tall now, with hair braided back and hands like Josie's, steady, sure. She was 17, curious, full of the same fire that had once filled Mary Beth and Tommy both. "I added to the new book today," Elsie said. Mary Beth smiled without turning. "What did you write?" Elsie took a breath. "That I found a kitten in the hayloft. That we named it Gentry. That I want to be the one who keeps the journals next." Mary Beth looked over. "It's not an easy job." "I know. You'll have to tell it all. The good, the hard, the parts we try not to say out loud." "I know." Mary Beth studied her, then nodded. "Then it's yours." They stood in silence for a while, the cold forgotten, and in that quiet, Mary Beth felt something shift, not an ending, but a turning of the page. She knew she didn't have many years left. Her bones ached more with each season. The names in the ledger were ones she didn't always recognize, but it didn't scare her, because the ranch would go on, because someone else would read the stories before supper, because someone else had chosen to stay. In the spring, a young woman from Wyoming showed up at the gate with dust in her boots and desperation in her eyes. She said she'd lost her family in a fire, said she didn't know where else to go, said someone in town had told her this was a place that didn't turn people away. Elsie opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "You're safe here." That night they made an extra place at the table. Mary Beth passed the blue journal to Elsie, and the girl read a story about a night long ago when Josie McCall first found a man slumped in his saddle, bleeding into the snow. The woman from Wyoming listened with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, tears slipping quietly down her face. When the story ended, she whispered, "Is it true?" Elsie nodded. Every word. More guests followed. Some stayed a season, others stayed for life, and each of them, in their own way, added to the story. They wrote about fence lines and thunderheads, about quilting circles and surprise colts, about porch dances and heartbreak, and the way the orchard always bloomed no matter what had been lost. And every journal, every page, every sentence carried the same thread. Not wealth, not power, not fame, but staying, choosing to stay through grief, through change, through hardship, through love. One summer evening, Elsie came across a journal entry in Silas's handwriting that she hadn't read before. It was dated just 2 weeks before he passed. If legacy means anything, let it be this, that someone felt loved enough to stay, that someone heard a story and chose to keep it alive, that someone walked through the gate, broken and tired, and left whole. She wrote it out again in her own journal, underlined it twice, and then added her own words beneath it. "We are still staying. The stories are still growing. The love has not faded, The gates are still open, and I will remember. And she did, for the rest of her life, because that was the promise, that the ranch would never forget, that those who came would always find a place, that love, quiet, enduring, stubborn love, would always have the last word. And in every new spring, as the blossoms opened again and filled the air with the scent of beginnings, someone would read from the old journals and say aloud, "To the children and the sky." This is where it all began, and this is where we stayed.